you have to give people moments to breathe and change their breath. I always say it may not have to be laughter, but can you change our breath multiple times in the story that it's, oh, all of those things. How can you change a person's breath while you listen and while they're listening to you? And just a one note story, all funny or all sad, is very, very challenging to listen to.
Welcome to Première Personne, a podcast about vulnerable storytelling where we unpack the transformative power of first-person narratives. I am your host, Brune Smith. Hello everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I had so much fun talking to Margot Leitman. She is the sweetest human, and she's also an award-winning storyteller, best-selling author, speaker, and teacher originally from New Jersey. She's a leading expert in the growing field of storytelling. She's written 2 books on the subject. The first one is called Long Story Short, The Only Storytelling Guide You'll Ever Need. It's one of my all-time favorite books. Her second one is called What's Your Story? A Workbook for the Storyteller in All of Us. She's also written a comedic memoir called Gawky Tales of an Extra Long Awkward Phase. She's written for NBC, DreamWorks TV, the Hallmark Channel, and the PixL Network, and a variety of print and online sources, including Cosmo and Backstage magazine. In 2016, she worked as the West Coast Story Scout for This American Life. Margot is a 5-time winner of the Moth StorySLAM and was the Moth GrandSLAM winner in New York City, achieving the series' first ever score of a perfect 10. Her stories have been featured on NPR's The Moth Podcast, Good Food, Unfictional, Strangers, and she is a frequent contributor to the popular podcast Risk, which we also mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. Margot is the founder of the storytelling program at the UCB Theater, where she's performed in dozens of shows over the years. She travels all over the world as a public speaker, storyteller, and teacher, although in this conversation we touch on how her work life has changed in the last few years and has evolved and is constantly morphing. Internationally, she has performed and taught at the Spoken Fest in Mumbai, India, as well as a 6-week teaching residency at the Blue Room Theatre in Australia. I was really glad that I got to ask her about the cultural differences that she was able to witness in her work when it comes to our relationship to first-person narratives and owning our story and allowing ourselves to share them with the world. In her spare time, Margot Leitman is an amateur baker, avid yogi, and a devoted bibliophile. She is a proud graduate of the Ithaca College Theater Department, and she now resides in Los Angeles. In this conversation, we touch on different things that I mentioned and also her relationship to writing, which is always a question I like asking my guests at the end of our conversations. Before we dive in, I wanted to let you know that from September 3rd to October 29th of 2023, I am running a writing and self-publishing program. Self-publishing is all about not waiting for someone else to give you permission to be yourself and to share the art, knowledge, wisdom that you have been hoarding inside of you. I think it's high time you shared all of that with the world. I will be with you every week with live coaching calls, and you'll get that sweet accountability so you actually show up and write the damn thing. I am so excited for that program. At the end of the program, we'll have a big book release party where we will all celebrate the fact that we will be published authors. If that piques your interest, go to my website right now. It's experiencenarrative.com, experiencenarrative.com. There is an early bird price, so you might want to go ahead and check that out sooner than later. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Here's Margot Leitman. Hello, Margot. Thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm great. I'm very excited to talk to you. It's sort of a dream come true
Oh,
because I read your book, Long Story Short, in 2018 when I took my first storytelling workshop. I was in Montreal back then.
beautiful.
And it's one of my favorite books of all time. So I'm very excited to be able to ask you a bunch of questions today. The first thing is this podcast is called Première Personne. So first of all, can you say Première Personne for me, please?
Oui, oui, première personne.
Amazing. What does that bring up for you?
First person, it just anything that is leading with I rather than he, she, they, telling someone else's story. It's you're telling your own story. That's how I think of it.
Great. I happen to know that you've been learning French.
Oui, oui,
Can you
yes.
tell me why and how's that going?
It's going well. I took it in high school and almost failed. I had a terrible time with it. But then when I was in college, I had this French boyfriend for a few years. So I some of it was kept up with. I learned a lot when you're with someone that is French speaking. And then I went to France a few times, and then my husband started learning Spanish during the pandemic, and I'm somewhat competitive with him, and I thought I'm going to pick up French again. So I've been studying every day, just on Duolingo for 2 years. But I've just started teaching a college course, and one of the students in my class is from France, and so you have to understand that in Los Angeles, I've sadly discovered that no one's speaking French out here. It's not a very practical language where I live because we're close to Mexico,
Right.
geographically. So a lot of people speak Spanish. That's where we are in the country. So
Mhm.
I found one person that speaks French. I met him on Monday, and I have one person to practice with.
Yay!
Yeah, so he's open to it. So yeah,
Great.
that's it.
Good. So before we dive into your story and how you ended up creating your job and the amazing story behind that, I want to do a quick rapid fire questions.
Okay, fun.
Okay. I have 10 rapid fire questions. So number 1, New York or LA?
Oh my gosh. But that you can't answer that because
Okay.
New York, if you are rich and have no children and are able-bodied, is great. New York, 100%. I went last
Mm.
week by myself all the way, New York. New York with children or with a body that can't get up and down stairs or what have you. No, LA. So with kids, LA for sure. With an
I see.
injury or any sort of physical disability, LA.
Number 2, Beyonce or Missy Elliott?
Missy Elliott. I know it's controversial.
Number 3, introvert or extrovert?
Introvert.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Number 4, coffee or beer?
Coffee.
Number 5, longhand or keyboard?
Longhand.
Number 6, the couch or the wilderness?
Wilderness.
Can I say you didn't say that very loud? Is there a reason?
It's almost a tie. I love them both equally, but there
Okay.
was like a slight, yeah.
Okay. Um, Number 7, I don't know if you've seen either of those shows, but if you have Russian Doll or White Lotus.
Oh, I've seen both. White Lotus.
Number 8, Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard or Design Matters with Debbie Millman.
I've never listened to either. I listened to
Okay.
one episode of Armchair Expert, the one with David Sedaris, of course, right? Because that's
Mm.
what I do. So I guess that one because I've only listened to one episode.
Okay, thank you. This might tie into my next question, the number 9. Regardless of fame, the first person that pops into your mind, favorite author of all time?
Oh my gosh. This is a weird one because he's not really known for his books, but I would say Jonathan Ames, who's more known for TV and film writing, but I love his memoirs and personal essay collections so much.
Thank you. I love an answer that's exactly what you just did. something that's unexpected. And number 10, risk or the moth?
The Moth.
Okay. For our listeners who don't know what the risk and the moth are, what a storytelling show is, can you explain, please?
Sure, there are two long-running storytelling shows, over a decade each, maybe even longer than 2 decades for The Moth. I'm not sure when it began, but that are national in America, at least national. I know The Moth is international. I don't know if Risk has done international shows. Perhaps they have, but they're both long-running storytelling shows with podcasts as well.
Thank you. And so how do you explain, and that's at the beginning of your book, but how do you explain to people who have never heard about live storytelling what it is?
It's telling one complete story as your entire set on stage in great detail. So instead of what many people are familiar with, which is stand up, which has many setups and premises that you can explore within, let's say, 10 minutes that you're on stage, storytelling is just one cohesive story. So the example is, you don't want to talk about how you're bad at dating. Here are some funny examples. You want to talk about your worst date in great detail, play by play. And that's the best way I can explain it, because I think almost anyone is familiar with stand-up comedy. So if you could compare it, I usually compare it to something that everyone is familiar with, and that seems to help.
Right. When did you first discover it?
In New York, well, I lived in New York about 11, 12 years ago for a long time, and I discovered it on the bookshelf first. I was in the Barnes and Noble in Union Square, and I picked up actually a book by Jonathan Ames called I Love You More Than You Know. I liked the cover, and I read it, and it was all essays, and it was really, really personal essays that were so deeply personal. I thought, oh my gosh, you can put this on a page? That's crazy. And then I went home to New Jersey for the weekend. I was visiting my family, and they had a manuscript of From Spalding Gray on a bookshelf, and I read that in a couple hours. And then I started just consuming anything I could that was premiere person, and as much as I could. And then I thought, so that was my first instinct, was like, I could put something like this on a page. And then around that time, a couple storytelling shows in New York City were popping up, not many. And I bartended in a theater space that at night as my survival job. And then one night they had a storytelling show. And then I just came up to them afterwards and I said, I have to be on this next month. So that's kind of the culmination of it. But it started with reading personal stories.
I see. And so before you started telling stories on stage, you were a comedian.
Mhm.
Um, how did comedy evolve for you into storytelling?
Well, I was a very reluctant stand up. I wasn't really a passion of mine. I just was, n- not to sound conceited, but I feel like I was pretty naturally funny, and that was just a vehicle to express that. In college and such, I was a theater major. I was always cast in funny roles, and I did funny things. So it was like, how do I express this? I was also in the time in a sketch comedy group and things like that, just finding different ways to express comedy. But I never really loved doing stand up. It always felt very, for me, just not the right vehicle. And and then when I realized, so basically how that evolved was that I would be booked on a stand-up show, but I would tell a full story instead in my stand-up slot. I started just kind of sneaking it in. And it was going, I mean, it's not the ideal way to tell a story because people aren't really prepared for that pacing in a fast-paced stand-up show. But I started doing that quite a bit. And then and then eventually enough storytelling shows popped up that I could just switch and do it in those spaces. Yeah.
Mm. What kind of stories did you tell, or do you tell?
Well, when I was telling them in stand-up shows, obviously I had to go for the funniest stories, sometimes even the most crass stories, because I knew that that would work in a space like that. Um, and then I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
What kind of stories are you drawn to tell from your life?
So now,
Yeah.
that was when I was sneaking them into stand-up shows. That's the type of story. It was always funny. But now I feel like everything has shifted. I mean, the pandemic and everything, it was almost like any story I told before makes no sense now and seems trite and
Mm,
silly and dumb.
right.
I also, I mean, I had children and then experienced a lot of loss within the last 3 years. So like a lot of things just feel like, oh, you thought that was a problem. That wasn't a problem. Or yeah, you know, that was upsetting to you. Really, you hadn't experienced anything. So a lot of things, you know,
Mm,
I wish I've kind of retired a lot of my stories because they don't really speak to me anymore, but they
mm,
did speak to me at the time. But I mean, you grow and you evolve, but like, uh, maybe they will feel I don't know. I was talking about it one time in therapy, and my therapist made a good point. He was saying that, you know, when the Beatles, when they put out Sergeant Pepper's Hearts Club, did they really feel like singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" anymore? They were kind of in a different space artistically at that point, and that the music had changed so much that yes, they still had made "I Want to Hold Your Hand," but that didn't speak to them anymore, and that wasn't really the type of art that they were making anymore. And I thought that was a really great, profound thing that he said that I think about a lot, which is that like some of the stories I told in the past aren't really something that I gravitate to now. Whereas I think now when I write something, I like, uh, I, I think that they're a little bit darker, probably because the world has become a little darker for me in the past few years. Then I think I had a lot more levity. Also, I've lived a lot longer, so in the beginning when I was telling stories, they tended to be about my youth and my childhood, and people
mm,
really responded really well to that. But now I've lived like this whole other life, so you know, more present day, more recent things. I tend to talk about things that have happened really recently. I'll tell stories about more.
mm. And so you've written several books. You are a Moth GrandSLAM winner. You're a storyteller. You also teach storytelling in different settings. You created a storytelling program at the Upright Citizen Brigade. Was that in New York or in LA?
I founded the program in New York, and then I brought it out to LA when I moved here. Yeah.
I see. Is that still running?
I am a little bit swamped and busy right now, so I'm not teaching there at the moment. But it it could be if I said I have time, yes. But it was up until I had to pull back on because of my schedule. Yeah.
Right, you taught there for many years.
Mhm.
Was there something, was there a moment with a student that comes back to you where you saw a big transformation for them as they learned how to tell a personal story?
Yeah, I mean, many times, many times. I saw people terrified to even raise their hand go on and win at the Moth months later. You know, many times. I've had students that were had no idea how to structure a story get book deals. I mean, there's so many things that have happened. Uh, I would say mostly the most rewarding I've seen are people that have experienced some sort of grand tragedy that's living inside of them that they have never spoken of ever. And then they find it freeing to speak about it in front of a room of strangers rather than reveal it to close friends. You know, it's almost as if they're coming out, you know, and they'll do it in the when I would run classes like that, we would have a final show that they could invite friends and family to, and the public could go as well. And so they would do their final performance, and it would almost be a coming out to the people they knew of like, by the way, this is something about me you may have never known. You know, people that were in car accidents where another party in the car accident died, you know, things like that, like at that things that have witnessed people that witness, you know, members of their family getting killed, people that have uh you know, been incarcerated and people didn't know, you know, things like that. I've seen like major transformations, and then they're free and they're lifted from it. It's almost like it just leaves their body and they can start the process of moving on.
So for those stories that involve trauma, would you say what are some things to look out for when working with someone on a story like that?
Well, I always say I am not a trained therapist, and I always make sure to make them aware of that, because one of the things I say in my book, and I really do stand by it, is that while there are many therapeutic aspects to storytelling, it should not be a substitution for therapy, because you're not working with a licensed therapist at all. Like someone like myself is not that. So there's that risk in a situation like that. So what I can do is help a person. I still look at a story that involves trauma in terms of structure. And I say, let's make this a well-written story that you can then be a well-performed story. Let's add all of these elements that we need to add to make it a good story. And that's how I can help the person. And then I always say, if you're thinking about something like this, where I used to, when I was teaching at UCB, we had a social worker that I could always say, you're always welcome to speak to the social worker there. I'm now teaching at a university. I'm sure a university has, resources like that as well. So, things like that where I can just direct people saying there's also this resource for you. But I'm always very careful to not let a person substitute a class with me for therapy, because that is not in my personal scope of practice. So I'm always very careful to be upfront and honest about that.
Mm. For people who think that they don't have any stories, what do you tell them?
Those are the people to look out for. They're probably going to be the best storyteller in the class. It just happened to me the other night in my new class at the university. Last person to go, didn't want to speak, and then, amazing performance. So it tends to be a person that any person that walks in the room thinks they're hilarious, that they're interesting, that they have so many things. Oh, which story do I choose from? My life is so crazy, is usually has nothing to say. So, and then when there's a person that's really apprehensive to get up, almost always they have the most amazing life. So I always say you don't have to have had a life where you're dangling off a cliff and someone reaches for your hand and you pull up. You just need to be able to tell a story about, your amazing sandwich well. That's it. You just need to tell the story well. And you need to care about the story you're telling and tell it with great passion. And therefore you will be fine. But a lot of people, I'm always wary of a person that thinks that they're interesting rather than a person that thinks they have no stories. I am very drawn to the people that think they have no stories.
Mm. You said you teach at the university. Is it a recent program? Is it because I feel like storytelling has become a movement, and then more and more people want to teach it. Is it a recent program at the university, or?
Oh, I'm not teaching storytelling, but I'm teaching
I see.
uh, pitching, the art of pitching, how to pitch something. So it's very similar.
Mm.
And that course was always in there. Yeah.
I see. Okay, so great. So pitching is one of the ways we can use storytelling in what kind of setting, for example?
Entertainment business specifically is what we're talking about it in. But I mean, there's so much storytelling in pitching. So it's a really big crossover thing. And it's one of the great ways that you can incorporate story into your professional life. And this is specifically geared for entertainment business pitching, but there's so many other ways. Entrepreneurs pitch, advertising executives pitch, inventors pitch, so there's just so many people are pitching to, in town meetings to try to get funding for their school. There's so many ways that people pitch. So it's a really useful skill, and you need to be able to tell the story of what you're trying to sell. So yeah, that's another way to incorporate storytelling.
So great. You teach storytelling also in companies.
Yes.
So can you tell me about that? How do you work with them? What do they usually call you for?
Usually I just work with companies and teach them how to tell a story properly, and then they incorporate it into whatever they're using it for. So I don't pretend that I know everything about law, for example, but I have worked in the field, various places that work in law, and taught them how to tell stories so that they can tell the story of, for example, their client's accident better to a courtroom. I have told, so it's however they want to utilize what I am saying. I've worked with many, many ad companies where they learn the art of telling a story properly, and then they go and they can land a deal much better. A lot of people in business, I've found, are very wary to ever reveal anything about their own story in their work. And once they realize that sometimes their story can help sell something, their story, you look at all of these amazing people in America, somebody like the woman, this Sarah, I think it's Longfield, or no, not Longfield, I forgot her last name, who started Spanx, like the shapewear. And she is always telling the story of how and why she's starting it. She used to cut the bottom of her pantyhose off and just wear the top of the pantyhose to make herself look 10 pounds lighter, and all of these things. She's very good at telling the story of it. Oprah Winfrey is very good at telling her story into her brand. And so all of these people, Michael Phelps is very good at telling his story in his brand. So all of these people, we're forgetting that all of these people are using their personal story to sell something, and people are so scared to do that. And I'm like, well, no one is going to buy Michael Phelps's online therapy program if they don't know that he's also been in therapy for years and that he suffers from anxiety. Like, why are we going to buy online therapy from a swimmer? Why? Like, that makes no sense. So unless you incorporate your story, often things can't sell. So, in the business world, it is actually an asset, but people forget that quite a bit.
Mm. And within a team, or when someone from a company is going to meet with a client, would you have any advice in terms of how they can incite other people to tell stories, like create this environment where people feel inspired to tell stories?
Yeah, because I think that we have to get beyond the mindset that vulnerability equals weakness in the workplace, and getting rid of the idea that, our leaders can't have ever failed, because failure is a part of all of our stories. And there's a lot of people that use their failures very well. Like Sarah Silverman often talks about getting fired from Saturday Night Live as a part of her story. And that, at the time probably felt like a huge failure, but she's had this amazing career. Steve Jobs getting fired from Apple for a bit and then having to come back, that was a part of his story. So telling the story of how you get there and the low points that's included is a really great way to invite other people in the workplace to share theirs. But I think we just focus so much on, at least in America, we're very like results oriented, but we're not really talking about the process. And the process involves failure. And then once we open that up, that opens up for other people to talk about, how did you end up here? What are the weird ways that you got here and the steps along the way? And what did you used to do? And how did that lead you? I don't know. I mean, there's very few people that have ever done one thing in their whole life. Like, how did all of the things they used to do have you end up here? So, yeah.
Mm. And for the people who do share their stories in a corporate setting, are there things that you shouldn't do when telling a story? It can be in any setting, actually, for this question.
I mean, I joke a lot, but it's not really a joke, that I've never wished that someone's story went on longer. I just think
Right.
brevity is key. I
Mm.
just don't know why people think they have to talk forever. It's challenging to speak for a short amount of time, but you can get a lot in. So that, I mean, overall, universally, keep it short.
Mm. You said your professional life has evolved quite a bit in the last few years. I mean, for a lot of people,
Yeah.
what could you tell us a bit about how it is structured today, your professional life around storytelling?
Yeah. So I do live shows. I coach a lot of people and individuals and organizations privately. That's been the biggest thing that opened up a lot since the pandemic, because pre-pandemic I had a business based on travel in large settings and groups, going and flying somewhere and speaking to a large group of people was my business before, and that all shut down. So working privately with people that are launching a podcast or writing a book or starting, I'm working with someone very closely right now that's starting a company that wants to tell the story of his new company. I'm working with a celebrity that is writing a memoir, that I'm helping her with, working with her on that. I'm Tomorrow I work with someone who's launching a podcast and wants to map out all the writing of that. So I work with a lot of individuals. I also have dabbled in starting a side business where I'm working. I love working in the law space of helping people, helping individuals who are in the courtroom being able to tell their story better, um, to a courtroom setting, and that's been something that's been really interesting to me, and helping lawyers be able to get the story out of their clients a little bit better and having them share their stories a little bit better in a way that can reach a jury in a more accessible way that we can understand what's happening and listen and really feel for the person up there on the stand. That's been a business that I've been working with a lot. And then I've been really, especially this past month, trying to finish a fiction story that I've been writing for years that I'm trying to turn in, which is a new avenue of storytelling. And then I've just started teaching at a university. So I'm insanely busy, which is why, unfortunately, I rescheduled this about 17 times.
Oh no. I so appreciate you taking the time. And so would you say, did the pandemic make it so that you work more with the US now than abroad, or is it still very
Yeah, I
international?
mean, before the pandemic, I was supposed to go, yeah, I had a lot of things scheduled that were travel. I mean, I was supposed to be in London, not London. I was supposed to be in England all summer, that summer of 2020, and I was going to be working in with a theater company in England for the summer, and that didn't, that was canceled. So, and then I had a bunch of conferences I was supposed to be speaking at and public speaking gigs that were all canceled. Yeah. So after the pandemic, but during the pandemic, when it was really, really locked down, I did teach a lot of online classes, and for the first time had people from all over the world in them, which I had never had before. And then additionally, I took classes. I had time to take writing classes again, and that had people from all over the world in those. So that was really uh, the only way I connected outside of the country during the pandemic. But it was different, but it was still rewarding. I'd have people from Australia in my classes, Portugal, France, China, everything.
Mm. And over the years, have you noticed cultural differences when it comes to personal storytelling?
All have been very welcoming to sharing stories, but I've only worked in this space in person in the US. I've worked in India, I've worked in Australia, and I would say all were very, very welcoming to sharing stories in those spaces. I have had over the years many students from Ireland, and I wanted to point out that culturally, I think there seems to be a value on storytelling so much in the culture of Ireland that I love. It's just it's just valued in a way that I wish more places would. Um, but uh, one funny story about this was, was that I was supposed to go. I was working with someone very closely to go to Iceland, who I had worked with, and I had worked with someone in the U.S. that wanted to bring me to her theater company in Iceland, and we were working really closely. And then it was getting towards the end of booking flights and such, and then I think it was the artistic director came back and just flat out said, "I'm sorry, we've discovered that there's no interest in storytelling." So we're gonna get like we've asked you around and like no one wants to take this. But I have never had someone be so upfront with me. And it was so funny that I was like, I wish people would be that direct with me in every aspect of my life. They're like, basically no one likes this. I'm sorry, forget it. And so now I am like, I'm going to Iceland. I'm going to find a way to go to Iceland because you don't want me. Oh, I'm coming. I'm coming to Iceland. Get ready. But so that was the strangest, experience. But it was just so, I've never had someone reject me in a way that was so direct that I actually, I really liked it. We don't like your art. I'm sorry. Please don't come.
Oh, there's a quote at the beginning of your book that says something along the lines of every moment is either a good story. Sorry, I ruined it. Good. It's either a good time or a good story. And I feel like this was one of those moments.
It's framed on my desk.
Oh, yay.
Yes.
Oh, nice. So you have it framed.
It's a good story. Yes. But it is a good story. And one of my clients, the client that's launching a company that I'm helping him with the storytelling of launching his company, they might be filming something in Iceland and they don't need me to come, but I'm forcing my way into the trip if they're going because I want to. If you say no to me, that's when I get really motivated.
Yeah. I sort of feel the same way with Brussels, where I moved a few months ago, and where the storytelling scene is pretty much non-existent, at least the personal storytelling scene, which is so fascinating because other than that, the cultural scene is very vibrant. They have a ton of other kinds of shows and theater and comedy and dance and everything. So I like a challenge. So
if there's an art scene, then I imagine it would go well. I think anywhere there is some sort of, that's not even true because I've seen storytelling shows pop up in the most unusual places in the US and that it's the only arts that is going on in the community and people are racing out the door. So I think it will work. I really, really will. I just, I would say that, have you booked your show?
Not yet.
So do you have a community of people out there?
I just flew in like a few months ago. So, I'm starting to, get nice connections and meet people. But
because my thing when I would produce shows and when I do produce shows is that I'm never concerned about, and I have had a big name on a show, sure, but like sometimes that'll draw people in, but what draws people in more is a person that's really excited to tell a story and their friends are really excited to watch them tell a story, and maybe it's the first or second time that they've told it, but they've worked so hard on it and they're probably going to be amazing. That's what I'm more likely to put a new person that is doing the work on a show because they will be more likely to bring people to watch them, therefore be more likely to build an audience, and those people will tell people and so on and so on. That was always my little trick to fill shows, was never to bring the big name, but to bring a new person really excited about the art form.
Yeah, my hope, I guess, I'm hopeful because there's a big international community in Brussels, because I feel like the people from Brussels or even from France who live in Brussels are often like, why would I tell a personal story? Or what kind, or like, why would I go listen to someone tell a personal story? So there's a lot of, convincing to do, I feel like.
But in the arts scene, are there one person shows, and is there stand-up comedy?
There is stand up. There's actually quite a bit of improv, so that's good. That's when
But
you
that's
know.
not
But
personal, you know.
true,
I
true.
mean,
I actually someone gave me a contact of someone who did a solo storytelling show. So there is something. Yeah, I will
yeah,
find
I mean,
people.
if there's people that do solo shows and people that
Mm,
do stand up, those are to me what I find to be the most similar. Improv is so different. I mean,
right,
there's
right.
small connections, and I use principles of improv and storytelling all the time and in life all the time. But um yeah, I mean that's tough. But I mean, the fact that they don't know why they would is probably why it would be so freeing to do it.
I know. Thanks for saying
And it
that.
doesn't have to be that personal. It could be something just kind of funny, that
Right.
they want to share. Yeah.
Mm, right. It doesn't have to be um, too revealing. We don't have to reveal something beyond what we're not ready to share. We don't have to
Yeah.
reveal something like traumatic or to have lived anything traumatic.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be as one of my favorite expressions, competitive grief. It doesn't need to be that.
Oh my God. It's a thing.
It is a thing. And it doesn't need to be that.
Yeah.
It just needs to be a good story. I went to the Moth a few months ago and with my friend, and I said, "Well, we're not going to win because our stories aren't very sad." We were joking because we were like, "I bet something sad's going to win." And but we both were like, "Let's put our names in and let's have a great time." And we both told stories and we both did really well. But no, we didn't. We didn't. So I don't know. I don't know. I'm not saying the Moth specifically is like that, but I will say that a lot of shows tend to reward whatever is the saddest. I've seen that quite a bit, and I understand that. But
Mm,
at the same time, we I think that scares people off to not want to tell a story because they think, "Oh, I don't have that sad a life, so I have nothing to tell." But you still do.
mm. What you do very well when you tell a sad story is bring in some levity in there.
Yeah.
Um, is there any other tip you would have for storytellers when they tell a tough story? Um,
Yeah, you don't want anything to be all one note. So while you still don't want a story to be all fluff, all fun and no substance, that's not good either. So then at the same time, you have to think about it. You don't want a story to be all sad and no levity. I always say that if you ever go to a religious service and the pastor or the rabbi or whoever makes any sort of a bad joke, the level of laughter that comes from the congregation is so loud. And it's not that the joke is so good, it's just that everyone needed to breathe for a second and relax for a second. So you have to give people moments to breathe and change their breath. I always say it may not have to be laughter, but can you change our breath multiple times in the story that it's oh all of those things? How can you change a person's breath while you listen and while they're listening to you? And just a one note story, all funny or all sad, is very, very challenging to listen to.
mm, fantastic. So you mentioned you are finishing the writing of a fiction book.
Yes.
Ha-
Oh
what
boy.
made you want to write fiction after so many years of doing nonfiction?
I That's a good question because this has been a rough time for me. I love I'm a big reader, and I will say this, that I think that if you are a writer, you need to also be a reader. And if you are a reader, you don't necessarily need to be a writer, but all writers should read. And so I read a lot of books, and I was reading a ton of these like mysteries, and I something came to me that I couldn't get out of my head, of a really good idea for one that could be also I could also incorporate humor into. And I just couldn't get it out of my head. And that is how all of my books have been, that like something, I get an idea and then I can't rest until it's done. All of my books have taken a lot less time than this, that being said. So I just felt like I had to. So basically, I've been writing this comedic thriller for years. I've had so much trouble finishing it because I had to understand novel structure, which was not something I knew. So I took classes. I took classes in how to finish your book. I took classes in suspense writing. I took classes in accountability. I joined a writers group. I formed a writers group. The reason I just went to New York last week was so I could be away from my children for a few days and just write. It's really challenging to write a novel for the first time. And I would say that my decision to also make it a mystery made it very complicated. But that probably means, because from great struggle comes great art, this will probably be the greatest thing I ever do, because it has been so challenging. And I do feel like we have to evolve as artists. Like I could make a cute little, gift book with storytelling games in it or something like that in my sleep. I can do something like that. But I want to keep evolving and keep using my brain. I mean, I don't know anything about how many lives we get, but as of right now, I know I have one. And so I'd like to do many things in this life. So yeah, I mean, that was also part of the reason I wanted to start teaching at a university. That was also something I've always wanted to do. And I thought, I'd love to give this a try and see how it goes, and I started this week. So I just feel like we have to evolve and keep using our brains. That's where stories come from. And I want to live a life and try different things and not just always do the same thing over and over again. So hopefully, I'm hoping that because Long Story Short was a bestseller, that will hopefully add something to making this novel sell well. Right now it's called Reunion. We'll see if that changes. But yeah, I have not turned it into my agent yet. And she's well aware that I have finished a full draft and not handed it into her. So it's not good. So yeah, I'm just tweaking it every day.
Oh, thank you so much for showing us the way of what it is to live a creative life, what it is to follow your passion, to create your job around your passion. And it's really, really inspiring. I think it's a great way to wrap up this conversation.
Oh,
thank you so much for... I can't wait to read your novel too. You already had in nonfiction a very strong voice, and I recommend your books, plural, to anyone. When you read your books, not you, when we read your books, we feel like we have just a best friend talking to us and cheering us on, and making jokes that are in a very supportive way. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And one thing, Brune, to say is that a big thing with my novel was I was writing it in the third person. A full draft I wrote. And then eventually I said, this has to be in the first person. It has to be told like one person telling their story. And that changed it tremendously, to be able to have it be a narrator whose voice we know and a person that we feel like is our friend telling the story. And that changed it a lot for me. So that goes on to, yes, even my fiction work is in premiere person. So
yeah, amazing. You're amazing. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad we did this in English, though. Next time we can do it in French.
Next time. Yay! Another challenge. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Margot. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you want to find Margot and interact with her in any way, you want to go to her website. It's margotleitman.com. The link is in the show notes. I will talk to you soon. Thank you for being here. If this podcast means something to you, it would mean so much to me if you'd be willing to take 30 seconds to do each or all of these 3 things. First, can you please follow or subscribe to Première Personne? While you're there, if you'd be willing to give me a 5-star rating and review and share an episode you loved with a friend, I would be so grateful. Première Personne is produced by me, Brune Smith, and you can email me through the contact form at experiencenarrative.com. Thanks for being here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.